Rebecca, thanks for that wonderful introduction there. You've made me sound way more interesting than I actually am, so appreciate that. Yeah, so I spent the summer in France this year. I'm a registered fanatic in camper vans and was fortunate enough to spend the whole of August in France with the love of my life. And let me show you, and there she is. She's beautiful, isn't she? That's the love of my life. She goes everywhere with me, has done for the past number of years, and we were fortunate enough to spend a month in France together over August. Now, France isn't a country I've really visited a lot in the past, so it was really interesting to get around the whole of France. Obviously, a lot of wine, a lot of food was involved, but also I got interested in French history whilst I was out there as well. And any of you who've heard me talk before, you'll know that I'm not an economist, and so it's slightly strange to be stood in front of you giving you a talk ostensibly about economics. I was actually a maths and physics teacher once upon a time, but whenever I talk about economics, I always say that it's really important to talk about economics through the lens of also history and also politics. And so today's talk is going to bring all three of those together and also sprinkle a bit of French history involved there as well. So let's go, and we're going now to the turn of the 18th century, so the 1700s are just coming in. We're about 320 years ago, and sat on the French throne is this chap here. This is Louis XIV, and Louis XIV is the longest reigning monarch throughout the whole of Europe. He's been sat on the throne for over 50 years at this point, and will go on to spend another 15 years on the throne. And Louis has been a real driving force behind France. France has gone from being a little bit backwater into being a real, continental European power under Louis's leadership. And Louis gets to 1701 and stands on the verge of greatness. Because in 1701, the King of Spain, Charles II, passes away in 1701. And in his will, when they get his will out, it turns out that he's left the whole of Spain to Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou. Now, imagine the probate on that thing. So France and Spain potentially going to come together and make this huge coalition force, and that sets a lot of people and gets people upset throughout the rest of Europe. Most notably the English. Nothing's changed there. The English are worried about a concentration of powers throughout Europe. But the Dutch and also the Holy Roman Empire get a little bit concerned about what's going on here. This concentration of France and Spain causes them some consternation. Now, Leopold I, who runs the Holy Roman Empire, thinks that he's got the solution. He basically sends his son Karl over from Austria and declares him basically unanimously to be the King of Spain. Unsurprisingly, the people of Spain think that that's not a great deal. Some dude turns up from Austria and takes over their country. Leopold's solution to that is a bit of cultural appropriation. That cultural appropriation being that he renames his son from Karl to Carlos. And understandably, the Spanish don't think that quite cuts the mustard. And what ensues is this long fight. It actually goes on for 14 years. This fight over who's going to get to run Spain now that Charles II has passed away. Louis gets really involved, and as a consequence, this war, which goes on for a number of years, pits the French and the Spanish against the English, the Dutch, and the Holy Roman Empire. Now, it turns out, and I'm sure the history buffs amongst you will know this, it turns out the English win, primarily through their naval supremacy, which means that the Spanish cede, and this is the treaty that does it, the Spanish cede Gibraltar to the UK. And also what happens in terms of what's going on in France is France are required to cede a lot of their new territories in the New World to the UK as well. So France have gone over and created New France, or Canada, as it subsequently becomes known. What they have to do is they have to turn over areas like Nova Scotia, Hudson Bay, etc., over to England. And so now the English are in charge of vast swathes of New France, or Canada as it became known. So that's where we'll go to now. We'll go to the New World, and we'll look at kind of Louis's position in the New World. And in the intervening period, during the period when the War of Spanish Succession has been taking place, along comes this guy, a guy called Pierre Le Moyne. Now, if you translate that into English, that's Peter the Average. And we'll leave him with his French name. Pierre Le Moyne was anything but average. So Pierre, who's based up in the Northern Territories, gets together a bunch of his friends and puts them in rowing boats. You know, they're basically the James Cracknell and the Ben Fogle of the day. And they get into their rowing boats and they row the length of the Mississippi. And before you know it, a couple of years transpire, but before you know it, Pierre and his friends notice that the waters change from being fresh water into being far more salty. Because what they've actually done is they've gone the entire length of the Mississippi and they're now in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, it's at that point that Pierre thinks, well, there's no more places to row. So he sets up a colony in the Gulf of Mexico. And in an act of sycophancy, he decides to rename the whole area, which is the name it retains today, Louisiana, in deference to his king, Louis XIV. Now, it's in September 1715, I should say, that Louis unfortunately passes away. He's been the longest reigning monarch that Europe's ever seen, even to this day, and is replaced by the Duke of Orleans, who's holding the fort really for Louis XV, who in 1715 is aged only 5. So the Duke of Orleans takes over the running of France, and just to prove that Pierre wasn't a single sycophant, he repeats the exercise and it christens basically the capital city or the capital colony within Louisiana, New Orleans, which again, it remains to this day. Let's cut back to continental Europe. So we're in 1700s in France, which of course means the Eiffel Tower isn't there, but the Duke of Orleans is. And the Duke of Orleans has a problem. Because of the War of Spanish Succession, France is bankrupt. It's basically as simple as that. France is essentially bankrupt. And so Duke of Orleans, who's in charge of running the country now, is scratching his beret and thinking, how do we get ourselves out of this trouble? Enter John Law. Now, John Law is an interesting guy. Interesting doesn't even barely cover John Laws. John Law is one of the most interesting historical people that you've never heard of, probably. Now, John Law was a Scottish guy, an incredible mathematician of his day. He was one of the early pioneers of probability. So himself and the likes of the Bernoulli brothers really understood probability, and they used that knowledge to basically take money off rich people in games of cards. And because these people, yes, they had money, but they had no understanding of probability. And John and the Bernoulli brothers earned lots of money on that basis. Now, John was, I guess if you were being kind to him, you would say he was a cad. He was a bounder. If you were being less kind, you might say he was a misogynist. He was an incredible womanizer, and he got himself into all sorts of scrapes as a result of this. One of which was he ended up challenging a guy to a duel over a joint love interest, where he actually kills the other chap. Now, this happens in England, and he's tried and convicted of murder, taken along, and he's been sentenced to death. Now, John, just to prove just how interesting he is, managed to escape captivity and stows away to Holland, where he turns up in Amsterdam, which at that moment in time is basically the central banking hub of the whole of the world. Banking is really starting to take off in 18th century Amsterdam, and John Laws gets really, really interested in the world of banking. And just to prove that mathematicians should never get involved in finance, I include myself in that, what John does is he starts to propose all sorts of new theories about how banking ought to work. And that culminates in 1705. He goes back to Scotland and he gives them this proposal. He goes to the people who are running Scotland and he says, I've created this paper, and it's entitled, there you'll see, Money and Trade, with a proposal for providing a nation with money. Now, that's an interesting paper and it's an interesting title. He takes that to Scotland, the Scots being far more interested in whether they should remain independent or become part of the union with England at that moment in time, decide that they're not interested. John subsequently takes that back to Holland, where the Dutch are not interested, but then he arrives in 1715 in France and he proposes this paper, I can create money that you can use as a nation. And the Duke of Orleans looks at this and thinks, I have no other options available to me. Let's give it a go. So what's in the paper? Because it's a real seminal paper in terms of banking as an industry. It really is, it really defines modern banking as you and I would know it. So there's a couple of things in this paper. The first one is that he comes up with the idea of let's get rid of coinage as we know it. So let's get rid of gold and silver coins and replace it with paper money. Now, there have been other exercises around Europe with paper money which haven't really gone to plan. So he comes up with the second idea, which is let's asset back that paper money. And he essentially says the future tax receipts that we receive from farmers throughout the whole of France, we'll use those monies and we'll use that land to asset back that paper money. Now, that paper money suddenly gets credibility. He's basically invented the first asset-backed security. It gets credibility and becomes common usage, so much so that the French are willing to take this in receipt of tax payments. And it's at that point when that paper money really comes into common circulation. Now that they've established their own currency, John then comes along and says we need a central bank in order to administer this, because what you can do at a central bank, of course, and you've got paper money, is you can print lots of it. And that's exactly what they do. And as a consequence, the French economy booms. The French economy is so strong for a number of years that the Duke of Orleans says to John Laws, we are not worthy. You shouldn't just be running the central bank. Let's give you some other portfolios to run as well. So he puts him in charge of the Treasury, which basically gives John Laws control over all tax receipts in France. And he also puts him in charge of international trade. And that's really interesting because that's the moment when John Law meets Pierre Lemoyne, who I introduced you to earlier. And these two get together and have a conversation. And John realizes that there's another trick to be pulled here. He looks at what's going on over in Mississippi and invents a new company called the Mississippi Stock Company. And the similar idea to what they've done with the paper money, he says, okay, well, let's create this company and let's issue shares in this company where the future payments and the future dividends will be paid by the phenomenal gains that we will see when we join the northern territories with the southern territories, and the amount of trade that will take place in our new world, and we'll be able to bring those dividend payments back to the modern world and use them to repay the national debt. That goes fantastically well. They issue shares in the Mississippi Stock Company at 500 livres. And it goes absolutely gangbusters. Within a couple of months, the shares are trading at almost 6,000 livres. So that's, in our parlance, that's a 12-bagger already. And they do a number of secondary transactions on the back of that. John sees how successful this company has become, because essentially what's going on here is, in modern day parlance, it's the equivalent of someone saying, I've gone to the moon. And it turns out on the moon, there's an abundance of helium-3 isotopes. And we can mine those helium-3 isotopes, bring them back to Earth, and it will provide all of our energy needs. Now, just pause for a moment. Someone will do that in the next 20 years. When you hear that investment pitch, run a million miles. But that will happen in the next 20 years. But it's the equivalent of that. He says, basically, all of this stuff that's going on in the New World, we'll be able to take advantage of that, bring the dividends back to France. French people will become absurdly rich. And for a while, they did become absurdly rich because anyone who was involved in the Mississippi Stock Company in its early days became a millionaire. In fact, the term millionaire was invented because of what was happening in the Mississippi Stock Company, where people suddenly had 1 million livres. On and on this goes. They do another IPO at 6,000 livres, and they use the proceeds of that to actually repay the national debt. That causes a little bit of a wobble in the share price, but on and on it goes to 10,000 livres. We're now on a 20-bagger. And it's at this point where people are just going absolutely nuts for what's going on in the Mississippi Stock Company. And so nuts are they going for it that some of the people from continental Europe decide to go and visit New Orleans. And just as would happen if you went there today, you'd come back a little bit disappointed. They came back to continental Europe and said, this world that we think we're buying into, it's not as attractive as we've been led to believe. So the share price meanders for a little bit of while. Then they realize the share price is going to collapse, and you absolutely know the game is over when the government step in. As you'll see on the chart there, the government have to step in order to prop the share price up for a while. That's the moment that the whole game's over. on it goes until eventually it collapses, and John Laws is basically extradited from the country. He's got a bunch of people chasing after him, and the whole Mississippi Stock Company is essentially the first stock market bubble. It was rapidly followed on by the South Sea Bubble, which was the English version of exactly the same thing. But the whole thing ends up with a couple of things, and let's just recap them. Louisiana and New Orleans gets built. It gets built with the proceeds from the IPO. The French government repay their debt. They repay their debts from the proceeds from the Mississippi Stock Company. But ultimately what happens is a lot of rich people and some middle class people have their money transferred to the French state, and then they're declared bankrupt in years to come. And that's exactly what you've seen there. Now let's, kind of what's the purpose of telling you that story? Well, if we run forward to the present day and have a look at some of the parallels that we can see today, well, first and foremost, we know that the English are still obsessed with a concentration of powers in Europe. We also know, however, that, wildly optimistic and expensive infrastructure projects which join the north of a country to the south of a country will always get sanctioned and paid for. And we also know that there will be people within society who will have wonderful plans of when a nation is so heavily indebted that they can get themselves out of that debt. Now, in more relevant terms, that's quantitative easing. But think about what quantitative easing is versus what John Laws suggested. It's essentially the same thing. And what you also know is when this kind of thing happens, when so much money is printed in such a short space of time, it will lead to financial asset bubbles. And Bitcoin, actually, if you do a trace of Bitcoin versus the Mississippi stock bubble, you can kind of guess what's going to happen in the next couple of years. So there's some of the predictions we can make as a consequence of our understanding of history. But the real takeaway, I think, is a much bigger picture than that. It's not some of these smaller stories. The real takeaway I get from the John Laws story is you should never, ever allow politicians to have access to a printing press. And that's where we are today. That's the thing I really want you to have a think about today. It's the independence of central banks. Now, central banks have only recently become independent. So in the UK, that was a 1997 phenomenon introduced by Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. It's a relatively new phenomenon. And the independence of central banks, I would argue, is being severely tested at this moment in time. You might remember in 2015, the Labour manifesto was to introduce something called People's QE, the printing of money in order to finance economic projects. Does it not sound familiar to what was happening in 1715? Well, that's exactly what we're looking at the moment. We are going through a period, the War of Spanish Succession, it basically is the equivalent of what we're seeing with COVID. It will lead lots and lots of nations so heavily indebted that they will look for new and novel ways to get their way out of it. Modern monetary theory is one of these things, but modern monetary theory is essentially what John Laws suggested 300 years ago. And so the independence of central banks, we think, is really going to be tested in the next couple of years. If they lose their independence, politicians will have access to a printing press, and that's not a good thing. And if they do get access to the printing press, you can bet your life that everything we saw in the 1700s to 1720s will be repeated in the next couple of years. So that's really what we'd expect to take a look for. And if you think this has all been a little bit contrived, and if you think I've selectively looked for things that fit the narrative, let me just leave you with this last one, which is in 1720, the city of Marseille was put under quarantine because they'd introduced bubonic plague, which had been imported through a trade route on one of the boats. The city was put into quarantine. Now, thankfully, and I don't think this is going to be the case with COVID, in Marseille they lost 40% of all the residents of Marseille to bubonic plague. Thankfully, that's not the situation we're in at the moment, but in Marseille they did introduce a 3-tier system of quarantine, and they also introduced lockdowns and furlough and very similar sorts of things. In fact, it's actually you were put into quarantine. You were not allowed out of quarantine until you've proven that you had actually, and this is the phrase that they used, a clean bill of health. And so actually, all the thing that was going on 300 years ago, we'll see it again today, and we'll see it again in the future. And that leaves me with the final thing, which is what the French would say. Now, There are other people who say history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. What the French would say is plus ça change.